Hello and welcome to the next episode of Coffee and Comebacks. And today I have joining me Mike Dawson. Mike's got a really interesting story. Currently, he's the owner and founder of MDA Ltd, an L&D consultancy at the heart of what they do. But Mike will take us through that in terms of the journey of the business that he has set up and has become incredibly successful in a short period of time. But before that, Mike served 17 years in the army across 2 stints, and joined at 17 years old. So as a boy soldier and went to Harrogate. So we've got some really interesting lessons and stories that he's also going to bring into the conversation today. But Mike, I'm going to hand over to you. If you could give us an introduction into really who you are. Obviously, I've given a brief insight, but great to have you here. And if you would just introduce our listeners to you and what makes you tick.
Yeah, hi Sam. First of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's great to be on. So Mike Dawson, as you've said, 2 stints in the military, 17 years, the bulk of which was what I've, relatively recently, just over a year ago, finished up as an ETS officer. So in L&D, traveling all over the place, delivering CLM, as some of your listeners will be familiar to, and then rolling into training design analysis, more in what was referred to as the LDA field, so the learning development advisor field. So did that, like I said, just short of a decade, literally like 4 months short of a decade. So there's a lesson there about when you click your 7 buttons about making sure that you hit the 10-year point, but I didn't do that, but never mind. So that was me then from a military perspective. Traveled, like I said, all over the place, spent time in Southeast Asia, Central Africa, the Middle East, as everybody did, Eastern Europe, all sorts of good stuff, worked with some interesting people, and did fundamentally what I'd probably describe as a non-standard ETS officer career, where I spent a minimal amount of time in the education centres doing like bread and butter core ETS business, and then spent much more time tri-service wide, working in different environments, spending a little bit of time within specialist communities, doing their training design and stuff. And that was great. And then one thing led to another, and I decided to pop smoke. I'm sure we'll talk about the reasons for that in a bit. And then set up an L&D consultancy with the idea that I was just going to one-man band it. That would be it, just get into contracting, into freelance work. And then 3 months after doing that, I started hiring people to work contracts on my behalf, and it snowballed from there. And I remember when we spoke last time, Sam, it was like the speed in which it's happened it's pretty phenomenal. But yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell. That's it, really. Yeah, straightforward.
And where did you grow up? So you joined the military at 17. So where did you grow up, and what sort of led you to make that decision at such a young age?
So I'm a Cornish boy through and through. So I was born in down in Cornwall. And for anyone familiar with Cornwall, you were either into sport or you surf. And thankfully I did both. But it got to the point where, I got to about 13, 14, and you have to start thinking, you're doing your options and what you're going to do. But my whole family, male side of my family, have served in the military for all the way back to the Reformation. So it was a given. But funnily enough, I actually wanted to join the RAF. I wanted to be a pilot because growing up in Cornwall, we had RAF St Morgan down there, and you had the air station at Culdrose as well, the Naval Air Station. So I was seeing helicopters all over the place all the time. I was like, oh, that sounds cool. And at that point, I wanted to be a bit different to my family. And that's a trend that's followed, that I go against the grain a little bit. I still maintain that. So I was like, oh, I want to do that. And then at that point, I was going through the process and like, oh, you need to wear glasses. You can't be a pilot. I was like, all right, okay. Which funnily enough wasn't the rule and isn't the rule now, but never mind. So I was like, what do I want to do then? So as a typical kid, I used to run around pretending to be a soldier. So I was like, oh, I'll just join the army then. And that was it. It was as simple as that. Absolutely as bare bones simple as that.
And we were talking earlier, weren't we, before we started recording, that you had sort of 2 parts to your military career.
Yeah.
And that an element, that a lot of the conversations that, how we've come together is the work that we do to support transitioning veterans and veterans in business. But actually, it's a real challenge, isn't it, when soldiers or, wherever you serve, any part of the service, you make that decision to leave. The settlement can be, for some, a really smooth journey, for others, a real bumpy ride, and some never really find their feet. So there's a real sort of mixture out there. And you had quite a different experience when you first left the military, didn't you? Would you be able to give us an insight into that? Because I think it's really useful for our listeners and really interesting.
Yeah, sure. So I got to that point during my first stint where I could feel myself burning out. At that point, during that time period, obviously it was still pretty kinetic in terms of operational tours, particularly in Afghanistan. And I was like, enough's enough. I'd seen it, I'd done it. I need to get out. And what I did, and on reflection, the mistake I made was I fell into the I've got all these qualifications trap. Every civvy company's going to love me because I'm a veteran and I've served and yada, yada, yada. So I'm going to roll out into the real world and be on £100,000 a year and it's going to be amazing and I'm going to be the best thing ever. And 6 months into leaving, I still didn't have a job. I was like, uh-oh. And thankfully at that point, because I'd done various number of tours, I had a bit of money set to one side, so I was still able to support myself. But I was like, this isn't supposed to be happening. Why? People are turning me away. I was still relatively young at that point. I was 24, 25, something like. And I'm like, what's happening? And in the space of those, what became 3 years or 2.5, 3 years, I was a gym instructor for Virgin Active because it was an easy job and it was paying and I was like, straight, great. I ended up selling cruises for Thomas Cook in a call center, which is, everything my qualifications led me towards. Selling Mediterranean cruises to retired people, which was fine. It was a great job and everything. Please don't get me wrong, but I was like, what? And then at one point, I was working commission only for a double glazing company, national double glazing company, like knocking on people's doors at 7 o'clock at night, trying to convince them to invite me back so I could.
Oh, it was you that knocked on my door.
Yeah, that's when we said we've met before, and you completely like get away from my house. I was like, yeah, so that was me, and I was like, what is going on? I was in a mountain of debt. I was in, I had, I wouldn't say severe drink problems, but I was turning to drink a bit because I couldn't quite understand what was happening. So I was drinking a lot. It was making me a very nasty person. I was lost. I was confused. And the only way I thought to get out of that, which is something that's relatively common and you hear about, is I've got to go back in the army. Because this isn't right, and this isn't what it was supposed to be, and I need the safety back, and I need the security back. So yeah, 2.5 in between 2.5 and 3 years out, I then re-enlisted.
And when you were serving again, did you feel that all of those challenges sort of fell away, and you were back to
stand wage, back into a system I understood, back into a system that had a place for me? That I fit in, that I had a role, I had job security, I had a roof over my head, all that sort of good stuff. And that was it. And instantly I was like, it was like a massive weight was taken off my shoulders and I felt relaxed again. Everything fell in, I was back into fears, I wasn't drinking as much, all that sort of stuff. It was great. And it was all like perfect.
Yeah, back in the environment. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because you won't be alone. I'm sure there's people listening that would have been through that journey and found it quite difficult when they leave. But for some, there isn't an option to rejoin. Obviously, we were talking about it, you were just on the cusp of being able to, from an age perspective. But we do see many that go back and have some form of affiliation with the services, whether it's as reserves or, going in as a a contractor in the training sort of way. I see quite a lot of that. But it's almost seeking comfort back in the group of people and organisation that and if the option isn't there for you to go back into it, for some they do find themselves in a bit of a vicious cycle, don't you think?
Yeah, and this is why I think one of the reasons when you see a lot of these larger civilian organisations that have military like veterans programs, so like Barclays, JP Morgan, Amazon, it's why they do so well. Because what they've actually, and again, world according to Mike, so there'll be people listening to this that fundamentally agree with what I'm about to say, but what those organizations have established is a military network outside the military. So it's people moving into something that's security and they're predominantly surrounded by people with shared experience. It's not necessarily that they want to go and work for Barclays. There's nothing wrong working for Barclays, I'm sure, but it's because they're in an environment where even if you're in different services to the next person, and you know this, Sam, anyway, veterans just chat to each other, and you instantly, well, on the majority of the time, feel at ease when you know the person you're talking to is a veteran, because you've got that shared experience. And that's why these programs do really, really well. But for people who don't manage to get onto those programs, it can be quite hard. And, you know, we've both seen it, and we probably know people personally that have struggled and had various ranges of experiences as they've tried to find themselves, as it were, in civilistry.
Yeah, and you're right, because there's lots of different elements, and I really want to touch on the entrepreneurial side at some point, because we touched on it earlier. But many will necessarily approach resettlement or transitioning looking at a job, and they're saying, I need to find a job, I need to, without, and I'm not saying this is true for everybody, because I'm sure there are people out there that do take this into consideration. It's talked about a lot more now, but for many, they won't necessarily think about things like, what about the impact on my physical health, on my mental health, on my finances in the right place? Have I got the support network around me to recognize this is going to be, even if you make the decision to leave and you really want to, and you're really excited about going into whatever role you're going into next, it can really sort of jump up and smack you in the face, can't it, when you suddenly realize, oh, that I'm not in that world anymore, and I'm missing the banter, and I'm missing all of these things. And it's, you know, trying to bring people together where they can help you in some of those elements. You know, there's a number of different organizations that are set up to help with PTSD and mental health, for example. What are your thoughts on that in terms of how, I guess, veterans can preempt some of those challenges, but also get help if they need it?
So yeah, it's a great question, and I think it all comes down to planning. So, and you'll see this all the time, and, you know, I'm sure we'll touch on LinkedIn a little bit, but every day that passes, I will see somebody who has signed off from the military, and they'll be like, I've just signed off. Here's my future availability date. Okay, great. And then 6 months later, they'll put another post up saying, oh, I'm getting out in 6 months. And then 3 months later, they'll be like, okay, that's great, but what's your plan? I mean, and it's difficult. And part of this issue for me, and again, this is going to ruffle feathers, but I don't particularly care, is the lack of ability in certain aspects with the career transition partnership, and how they're setting our servicemen and women up for that step across. And a perfect example of that is these lies that they tell you about, oh, if you've been on £40,000 for the last however many years, to maintain your lifestyle, you need a job that pays you £70,000 in civilistry. You're not going to get it. There is such a minute minority of people coming out of the military that will walk into such a high paying job. And that's just fact. But it's probably twice a week I deal with reaching out to veterans, because I've got contracts to fulfill. I'll give you a live example. So I had a 3-month contract to fill. It was paying £20,000, and the veteran turned around to me and said, that's not enough money. And I'm like, I'm sorry? It's like, yeah, it's only 20 grand for 3 months work. I'm like, I'm sorry? And he went, yeah, but I've been told that I need to be earning this a year and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, right, fine, great. And that's not the veteran's fault per se, but that advice from the moment you sign off, and it probably just before as well, you've got to get out there, start networking straight away. It frustrates me when people, and it's an educational thing. I'll only start networking when I'm 6 months out from leaving. I'll only do it when I'm 3 months out. Oh, I'm leaving the army in 2 weeks and I still don't have a job. I've been there and I've experienced it, and I get that it's difficult, but the mechanisms and the tools and the software and stuff that we have now in comparison to when I left, even though LinkedIn existed then, but it wasn't really a known thing.
No, it was a thing.
There are avenues out there, and, you know, I'll talk about it quite heavily on this. Get on the Gen Dit network on LinkedIn. It is the biggest tool for veterans. You know this, Sam, anyway, obviously, because we've worked on things with them together. People asking questions, how do you do this? How do you do that? Events, you know, the big events coming up that Chris Shaw, the guy that's running the network, is putting together. Get on these things straight away. Start planning, because my big bugbear is people that leave their resettlement to like 2 minutes before, an exaggeration, and then they leave and they're like, oh, I still don't have anything. You know, there are ample opportunities out there, but the biggest takeaway is it's not going to be done for you. You've got to do it for yourself.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's really good advice. And actually, in some ways, as much as I think sometimes when you leave, I remember when I signed off and I actually had a job offer lined up. So I was quite frustrated in a way because I couldn't just leave.
Yep.
And then I ended up taking another job. And anyway, yeah, as I've spoken about before, that wasn't the right one. I decided to leave that pretty soon. And I think if I look back now, I hadn't really focused in on what it was that I really wanted to be doing and the sort of things that I needed to be doing. I definitely didn't, I mean, this was back in 2008, so LinkedIn wasn't as sort of viral and effective, I would say, as it is now in terms of professional networking. But I think what has grown, we definitely need to touch on Gen Dip Network as well, is this sort of, you can look at the opportunity of that 12 months that you have or whatever long that period of time to say, I can get out and have conversations. I can use this time to discount things as much as I can to find things. I think that's really important, that it's about a two-way conversation per se, and start looking and going, just because they offer me something or that's available as an opportunity, is it what I really want? Does it align with who I am, what I'm trying to do? And maybe just use that opportunity to also reach out to people like yourself, like me, like others, to say, what's it actually like setting up your own business, for example? What's it actually like working in the corporate environment? And just get a feel for it. I think it could be a really good use of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as an extension to that as well, when you mentioned just at the first point there about understanding what it is you want to do. So what you'll see quite often, and putting my ETS hat on now, where people talk about their ELCs and using those pots of money for their qualifications, you'll see people be like, oh, I've just booked myself to do a project management course, or I'm doing an agile project.
I did Prince too, never used it.
And it's like, oh, you've never used it. And it's like, that's great. That's a great course, but do you want to go into project management? Well, I'm not really sure. I'm like, well, is that an effective use of £3,000 then? Because they're not multi-hit. So think about what you want. Oh, but everyone's talking about agile. Yeah, of course they are, because it's bloody everywhere. But does that mean you want to do that? Oh, I think a Scrum Master role. Okay, great. But there's better ways to fund that than using a £3,000 pot of money. Think about what you're doing. And one of the biggest pieces of advice I give to everybody with their ELCs is, if you still have all three pots when you sign off, leave one for when you're in the civvy street. Because as you've experienced, Sam, and I've experienced, you could get 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the line and be like, this is not for me. Oh my God, what have I done? And if you've still got that pot of money there, you've got flexibility where you can go, I've had 12 months in Civvy Street, but I've seen this stuff and that looks interesting. And that's more me. Hold on, I've got some money to pay for that. And you can go and qualify yourself in all the necessary bits and pieces you need. Don't burn all your ELCs before you
don't know what you don't know, do you? Because you can get into an environment and things can definitely change. So just going back to the sort of the challenge element of what you've experienced on your journey, would you say that period of your life in between your service career was your sort of the point you faced your biggest challenge, or have you faced other challenges that you would say surpass those?
There's probably been some others, to be perfectly honest with you. Don't get me wrong, it was a difficult period in my life. That again I mentioned before about being a bit lost and confused, but it definitely wasn't the hardest point in my life. I mean, the hardest point in my life was between the age of 14 and 16. That was fundamentally the worst part of my life. But positives that came out of that and how that shaped me as a person has been quite important. And I still, people who know me and have known me for quite some time, who know my history, will know they can point at that exact moment as to why how I react to certain things. So for instance, I don't get bothered by stuff. I just don't. Oh, that's a big problem. Is it really? It's really not, is it? Oh, looking at my business now, oh, look at that tax bill. I'm like, yeah, all right, it's got to be paid, isn't it?
It's what it is.
Yeah, because I've been, that period between 14 and 16, I was below rock bottom. I was in a lot of trouble. And yeah, so that for me is not the benchmark, because that makes it look like a positive, but that was, everything that happens to me now, I'm like, well, is it that? And the answer's always no. So it's like, okay, cool, just crack on then. But that 3 years was difficult, but I've had other defining moments in my life that have made me realize that just step back, take a breath, and is it actually as bad as you think it is? And 9 times out of 10, it's just not.
And it sounds like you really built your resilience through, you know, your experiences when you were younger, and then built on those. But were there other elements that then got you into a positive space that you would say came from within or from others? How did you really move forward in such a positive way after such a difficult time?
I think it was just a case of, and it wasn't, you know, it was never a case of I woke up the next day and was like, everything's sunshine and rainbows, I'm going to be positive about it now, because it was a process and it took a long time. But, you know, there's always been those key touch points, as it is with most people's lives. There's key moments in your life that shape the type of human being you are, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. It's just how nature works. And, you know, those 2 years, and I'm happy to talk about it, it's not like a big secret. Everything for me falls back to those 2 years. So even when in that gap between my 2 stints in the military, where it was like I was low, I was turning to alcohol, all that sort of stuff, to get myself out of that, other than when I said I'll just re-enlist, I referred back to that period, you know, 10 whatever it was years before, and I'm like, well, the resilience that's taught me. And even now, when I set up a business and people say to me, "Oh, it's going to fail," you know, what experience have you got? And I'm like, you have absolutely no idea what I'm capable of. So stop. And randomly, as corny as this is about to sound, my favorite show is Ted Lasso, and there's a quote in Ted Lasso where he's playing darts and he talks about be curious, not judgmental. So just ask me questions. Don't make judgments based on what you think. Just ask questions. Be curious rather than being judgmental. And I align that to everything.
That's a good line.
Yeah.
So would you, going back to your point, is it something you could share with us around what happened during that period of
sure.
life?
So I was 14. I was at school. As everybody was at 14, I don't know why I made that point. I went home, so walked home, and my mum had packed up the house and gone. I broke in because that's where I was, because I needed to get in. All the kit was gone. She'd met somebody and decided that was it. I didn't know this at the time. It was just the house was pretty much empty. And I'm like, shit, what's going on? So I was like, right. So I stayed there for a couple of days. Then the landlord, because it was a rented house, started knocking on. She'd not paid any of the rent. So I then was like, right, what do I do? Started like sofa surfing with friends, and that didn't last too long because, you know, there's a limit to most people's goodwill, rightly or wrongly. So I ended up on the streets. So I was homeless for just short of 2 years. So 14 and a half, 15, up until just before, well, not short of my 16th birthday. So living on the streets. Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah.
Wow.
So, and that was, you know, I look at it now, and when you tell people, they're like, oh my God, that's horrendous. And yeah, it was, but the amount of positives I've drawn out of that. And when I was saying just now about no matter what happens, it's like, it's not that.
What a different direction your life could have gone in, you know. Yeah. When you think about what you've achieved, just on, do you look at the army as being part of what saved you in terms of not going in a different direction?
100%. You know, it's, you know, when I started at Harrogate, I was back on 3 meals a day, which I hadn't done, and it sounds a bit weird to say, but
perspective, doesn't it?
100%. And you know, but I look back, and this is going to sound strange to people, but I look back on that period of my life with a certain degree of fondness, because what it's done for me is, and there's been negative connotations to it as well, for a while, where I didn't trust people. You know,
abandonment. It can have real issues with how you form relationships and create relationships on any level.
Yeah. And this was the biggest contradiction. So when I told people that what I was going to be setting up as a business, or even when I was becoming an ETS officer and whose sole job is teaching, they're like, yeah, but you're a very like isolated person. And it's not that I was isolated, I just prefer my own company. And I've always been like that. So people couldn't quite understand when I said setting up a learning and development well, but you're going to be talking to people. I'm like, yeah, I love talking to people. Yeah, but why? I went, because I just do. And it's all shaped by that. And when you've spent a period of your life sat on the pavement asking people for change, it puts everything into perspective.
Did you go to school during that time?
Yeah. So I had all my school uniform in my bag. So I was, the school didn't know. Well, one person ended up knowing, one of the teachers ended up knowing, but I was getting into school early when the caretaker was getting there, so I could use the showers and I could wash. I got to the point at one stage where one of the teachers was washing my school uniform for me. So we didn't look like it was living in a bag. So I was still at school, still doing my GCSEs, still.
So you learned to survive, basically.
Yeah. And it's like people make fun, and it's interesting because both my children now are old, well, not old, they're 11, 8, and 1.5. And they're all in, well, the first two are into rugby. And I remember that period in my life, I was still playing rugby, and because I had no money, I had electrical tape holding my boots together. So the whole splits down one side. So I was literally putting my boots on and then taping them up. So yeah, and it's just stuff like that. And it just makes me, every opportunity I get now is a bit, I use blessing as a word. It's not from a spiritual place or any of that nonsense. It's just a blessing, so everything, the business is great. My military career was great. My kids are healthy, but everything drives me going back to that 2-year period in my life where I'm like,
where you could just think nothing could get much lower than that. I mean, yeah, God forbid. But it's one of those that's pretty rock bottom, isn't it?
Yeah, but again, Sam, I genuinely look back on it with fondness. I do, because it shaped the person I am now. And there's been, like I said, there's been negative aspects of that, but predominantly it's shaped me in a positive way.
Obviously, you don't have to answer, but have you had any contact with your mum since?
Nope. Well, yes, but how blunt can I be when I say this? Bear in mind it's a podcast. So she was diagnosed with dementia a few years ago. And I'll be quite honest with you and the people listening, that was a regret, a disappointment for me, because it now means she has no idea of what she did to me. And so no, I don't take my children to their house. There was a period where I did, because I was all about, you didn't understand, what was the reasons, there could have been other reasons. And the straw that broke the camel's back was not long after the diagnosis, because we had to go through her medical records and stuff, because she was going down that process of not being aware of what she was doing. And I found out that when she was pregnant with me, she tried to kill me. And then the day after she gave birth, she used to tell a story that I remember, where she was disorientated after birth, and she walked out of the hospital and the nurse was like, "Have you forgotten something? Or what about your son?" And it was actually intentional. And it's like, yeah, so I only found that out 3.5 years ago. So that for me was, where there could have been a bit of an inkling, where I could have, touched base with her and seen if there was anything to repair. Absolutely not. And I can't imagine, regardless of circumstances, somebody, as a parent, there's not a situation alive where I would do anything like that to my children. So no. I just don't. So no, she's alive, but she's very much dead to me. And rightly or wrongly, that's where I'm at with it.
And I think there's something in life where I can't empathise, so I can't put myself in your position, but equally I can sort of understand why you would reach that sort of space in your life. And like you say, it must really shape it how you are as a pet. I mean, my nowhere near like that, but my father left when I was 5 years old, and the last memory I had of my dad, he gave me a 20p mix-up in the hallway. I could still see it like it was yesterday. And I was a real daddy's girl. And he said, "I'll pick you up on Sunday." And he didn't pick me up on Sunday. And my mum said every Sunday for months I would sit on the doorstep, and eventually I gave up. But I then went and met him when I was an adult, and he had said how much he regretted it, not knowing me when I was growing up and all those things. And I said, I'm really glad I've met you, because I realised I've not missed you in my life, and I never saw him again. But I just needed to make that decision for myself. And I think, if anything, I hope it makes me a better parent, because I'm determined to be present in my children's lives. And thanks, Mike, for sharing that with us, because that is an incredibly personal account from you. But just going back to then how you draw the strength from that. I mean, I'm just in awe of you, to be honest with you, in terms of what you've just said and your level of resilience and determination and all of those things. So could you bring us back into the now before we go on to some coffee break questions? And I know you spent days or weeks working out your favorite film and why it's your favorite film. So we probably need to leave enough time for that, because it best be good. No pressure.
Yeah, maybe.
So before we go on to the coffee break, how would you summarize, given everything that you've shared with us, the good and the difficult, and just the unfathomable, to be honest with you, what do you bring into your day-to-day toolkit now that just spurs you on and, like you say, draws the positives for you?
So it can probably be summarized quite easily in a sense that every day for me, from a business perspective, from a personal perspective, is no one can tell me no. And I don't mean that in a teenage, I'm not going to do that time away. I mean, if I think I can do something, I'll do it. And because what's the alternative? You just succumb to people's doubts about you. So there's been 2 occasions in my life where I've not done that. And the one we've literally just spoken about. And then the other one, I still am a big football fan, but everything about me, I was obsessed with football. I wanted to play football.
I'll forgive you.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. And I always wanted to play in goal. And I was only about 12, I think. And the PE teacher at the school said, you need to stop playing in goal now because you're too short. And so I did, and I stopped, and it was all I wanted to be. I wanted to be a goalie. And funnily enough, I am way too short to have ever made it anywhere near even semi.
You're not that short, I bet you. You're not that short.
I'm 5'7", so I'm definitely too short to be a football goalkeeper. But I listened, and Fenlon, it did play out in a positive way, that one. But for me now, whether it's in my military career, I got told I was too old to go to Sandhurst. You're not going to get through. Then I got told my business was going to fail because I had no experience. All businesses fail, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like,
75% of small businesses fail.
Yep. But I'm in the 25%. But the important statistic there is with that 75%, and, we're both privy to that, and you hear it a lot, is, but understanding why. And I would argue, and I don't have any data to back this up, but I would argue a certain percentage of those 75% fail because they don't really understand what they're getting into before they do it. We were talking just before about a conversation I had with my accountant about company cars and how I was blown away by how much that would actually cost. People going out and getting business loans, and then the business it stagnates and they don't have the money to pay those business loans back. So for me as a company, we don't have any shareholders. I've not had any investment. I don't have a business loan against it, and I refuse to, because I'm not owing other people anything. It's my business, and it either succeeds because of me or it fails because of me. It's as simple as that. And that's the kind of attitude I've had with everything. If I fail at something, it's because I've not tried hard enough, or it's not been the right time to be doing that thing or something else. If I succeed at something, it's because I've dedicated all my energy and effort into that thing, and that's why I've succeeded.
Yeah. I absolutely love what you say there, because you take full accountability. You will take full accountability if it doesn't work. And, there have been many things I've done in my life where I've looked back and gone, well, as much as you might go through a period of denial of, that's not fair, whatever, you look back and you can, if you're honest with yourself and say, yeah, but I didn't quite do that, or I could have done that differently. And I think that's something that we could all do better at, I think, which is being fully accountable, but also being fully, I'm with you, and I'm sure we'll come on to business and finance once we sort of get into the next part of our conversation. But in my business, I have done everything in terms of building my business from a blank sheet of paper. I will not acquire clients through any other way than conversation, because for me, it is, I want to practice what I preach and not have poor financial management in my personal business life. But equally, I don't want to feel like I ever owe anybody anything in that way. And I think when you've had nothing, I come from nothing pretty much as a young child. I think you're always grateful for what you have. So you're not greedy. You don't sort of look for more than what you need. But equally, you say, I don't want to go to that space where I can have my roof taken, the roof over my head. And I say that knowing that you've been in a space where you didn't have a roof over your head. So it must be something really important.
Yeah. And that's it. And everything for me goes, and I've said it multiple times already, but everything for me goes back to that period in my life. Oh, but that client's 5 days overdue with this, and this isn't going to happen. I'm like, all right, okay, it'll get sorted. Oh, and there'll be people listening who will, you need to be a bit firmer with stuff like that. Yeah, probably not. But I'm a massive, massive believer, whether it's in business or personal life, you walk your path. You find out stuff, you fail at stuff, you succeed at stuff, but it's still your path. And other people can in at times with, oh, maybe you should have done it like this, and maybe you should have done it like that. Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'll always listen, I'll always be respectful, but it's my path. And that's why, we talk about shaping me as a parent. My children will have their own lives at 11 and 8, and even my 18, 20-month-old now that has his own life. I'm not going to shape their lives. If my kid tells me he wants to be a bin man, as long as he's made an informed decision, then that's his path, and crack on. I'm not going to tell people what to do, because I don't expect people to tell me what to do. Right. Which is ironic, considering I spent 17 years in the army being told what to do.
Feels like a good time to go into coffee break, Mike. So come on then. What is your all-time favourite film, and importantly, why?
So my all-time favourite film is Avatar, and so the reason why, and again, if people haven't watched Avatar, then what's wrong with you? You should.
I haven't.
Right. So this weekend, please bear in mind it's a long film. Endeavour, put it in your diary, watch Avatar, and it'll make sense. So I won't, no spoilers, but the whole one of the key principles to Avatar is it's a military guy, part of a system, had some injuries, had some troubles, all that sort of stuff, and he feels part of that system. And then he ventures into a new group of individuals. I won't refer to who because you've not watched it, but a group of individuals. And
don't worry about me. You can give me spoilers.
Cool. And then he finds out that was his true place, and that was where he belonged, and he was willing to change. We didn't change. He just realized that that's who he was, and he was willing to protect it at all costs. And the reason I love it is because that's true of everything. So what I've been thrashing my mind over is how to refer this back to how I'd speak to veterans about it. And the point I get at is, just because you were part of a system that you believed you are that system and you're part of it, doesn't mean that your place can't be somewhere else, that you can't find a new path, that you can't find a new place. So, veterans who still, and there's nothing wrong with it, there's nothing wrong with being proud of what you achieved, but veterans that still use that as the primary identification of who they are the ones that potentially have issues with finding a place in civilistry. And the moral of the Avatar story for me is, don't be afraid to find something else. Don't be afraid to have your eyes open, to be like, actually, this is where I belong, and this is where I'm supposed to be, and this is the right decision for me. That's why I like Avatar, because it's all about finding your real purpose and where you really belong and who you really belong with.
Well, you've actually sold it to me now, because my daughter went to watch Avatar 2, and I was like, there's no way I'm watching it. It's 3 hours or so, and I don't sit still for 3 hours unless I absolutely have to. So she went to watch it with friends. But yeah, I'm with you on that, and I think there's so many good messages in the purpose. So I can see why you thought about it for a long time.
I'm trying to think to myself is like give a relatively decent answer that doesn't just consist of because it's a good film. So, but it is a great film.
Yeah. Okay. I do need to challenge myself to watch it. I can't promise this weekend though, because I'm going to watch a rugby tomorrow. So that's going to be up on my list. What's the last book that you read or listened to? Are you a book reader, or you tend to be more listening to books?
So I refuse to listen to books. So just as the same way as I refuse to read from a Kindle, I don't agree with it at all. It's just and weirdly, I remember I got told the word for this and I've completely forgotten it. But I'm one of those people who smell books. When I get a book, I smell it and I decide if it's going to.
Definitely weird. Yeah, definitely
weird, isn't it? So everybody's not having a book, So I've got one of my day stacks around the corner because I've been here, there, and everywhere this week. Well, I actually got 2. One's full of kit and laptops and stuff, and the other one's got 6 books in it, actual physical books. Because to add to my weirdness when it comes to books, I won't finish a book. I'll have 3 or 4 on the go at the same time. So I'm reading at the moment. I'm rereading a book by Daniel Kim called Noise. It's a great book, so I recommend anyone, particularly if you're getting into project management, to read that. Yeah. I'm halfway through Barack Obama's first part of his memoir, which is a slog because it's 1 trillion pages long, but interesting. Yeah. And I'm also reading a change management book. that's just an academic book at the minute, just because it's relevant to something else I'm doing with one of my clients. And I'm also rereading Black Box Thinking.
Great book.
Yeah, very good book. And Rebel Ideas, but I've not started rereading that one yet. So I've got them both. But I'm one of those people that I revisit books. So I'll read it, and then about 3 months later, I'll read the same book again, and highlight, particularly from a business perspective, things like What's Thinking. All my books, even my Barack Obama one, which I've got things highlighted and things underlined and ideas and stuff. Just because
Barack Obama's a bit like War and Peace, but it's there's some good stuff in there. You got to find it.
Yeah, that's if you've got the time and the inclination, that's definitely an airplane book, because you're
or a listen to book. I can't believe you don't like listening to books. See, I am on the other end of the scale where I absolutely love reading books. I really do. I have bookshelves of books. I have boxes of books that I still haven't unpacked from when I moved house and things like that. I love books, and I often, if I go and download a book on my iPad, Audible, whatever, I often buy it physically as well, because I like to go through and certain things highlight and pull out. But I rarely, and there's an argument about time and what you prioritize, but I rarely have or find the time to sit and read a book. So I'm often listening when I'm in the car, when I'm on the train, when I'm out walking the dog, whatever. And that's when I could sort of consume my media. So it's, it's interesting.
It's horses for courses though, isn't it? And I mean, it's, I make the point, I fell out of this quite a bit when I started the business, just because other things took over. But I 15 to 20 minutes every day, all electronic devices get shut off, everything, and I read a book, and it's just habit. And I've slowly over the last probably 6-7 weeks got back into that, which has been really good. And it's just something I've always had comfort in, just reading a book. My eldest boy does exactly the same. He's obsessed with reading.
So I make my kids do that. Maybe I should spur myself back into the habit.
Oh yeah, but my second kid's absolutely no chance. If it's not Roblox or YouTube, he's not interested in. So I've got more chance of him setting fire to a book than reading one, if I'm perfectly honest.
Brilliant. I feel like you've already shared quite a lot with us, so I don't know if that was a fact you were going to share, or if you spent an equal amount of time thinking about an interesting fact that most people won't know about you.
No, so I haven't already shared it. So again, continuing with my perceived weirdness. So I'm a pagan, so I'm actually a Wiccan. So yeah, so I use the word pagan because it's something most people are familiar with. Because when I tell people I'm a Wiccan, people are like, "Does that mean you're a witch?" I'm like, "No, that doesn't mean I'm a witch." So being,
go on, explain.
So being Cornish obviously links like the Celtic, being not that identifies Celtic. I'm not in the Cornish independence movement or anything like that. But
do you speak Cornish?
I don't speak Cornish, no. So, which is people in Cornwall now listening to your podcast are like, no. But no, I don't. But what I am is, I'm a Wiccan, so, or pagan, there's more people familiar with it. And then not in this modern wave of people that have watched Vikings and have all of a sudden decided that they're pagans and Vikings, not like that. So it's a part of the way of life, so very, very elemental. So when I kind of touched on, when I said the word blessing, but I don't mean it in a spiritual way, that was a separation from that. Because, so it's what I do, it's who I am. I read tarot cards for people. Used to do that a lot as a very young kid at fairs and stuff.
Oh, wow.
Tarot. Yeah.
So just as a minute education for me, who's clearly very ignorant in terms of exactly what that means, and maybe and probably others, what does that mean in terms of how it comes into your day-to-day life?
So Wiccan, pagan, broadly paganism. So it's all about, it can be multiple gods, it can be no gods. It's very much just a case of you are who you are and you walk your own path. And if somebody wants to worship a god, that's awesome. If someone wants to worship this door, that's awesome as well. You do you, as long as you're happy. And there's a big belief in the earth and nature. So I'm very elemental. So I believe, in the power of the water, the power of the sun, all that sort of good stuff. So other people who have similar beliefs to me will use crystals and stuff for feeling particular ways. My kids have got crystals. And it's just how it is. But the essence of it is, you do you. So there's no judgment. There's no anything. If you want to do this, do that. If you don't want to do that, do this. There's people in my family who are Wiccan, who are practicing witches, not the pointy nose, pointy hat, Hollywood style witches, but garden witches, so that everything they do is around herbalism, and not that type of herbalism, but actual garden stuff that grows in the garden, and they don't eat processed stuff, and they grow everything they eat,
Wow.
sort of stuff. So yeah, that's pretty much me.
I mean, the concept of you do you sounds a fundamental value for everyone. It's actually a really good point and lesson, no matter what your beliefs, isn't it?
Yeah.
We can too often focus on other people's judgment and opinions, and I think with age and maturity, a lot of us get to a place of going, I am what I am, sort of thing, without breaking into song, which it always makes you want to do whenever I say that. But I think some people spend their whole lives worrying about what other people think of them. And my son, who far smarter than me, just been awarded an academic scholarship, which is pretty impressive, because 2 years ago, after lockdown, I was having to get him a tutor because we thought he had learning difficulties, but he actually didn't. He just struggled through lockdown. But going back to my son, he said something the other day, and he said, no, one is opinion and one is fact. So that's the fact. Opinion, I can have whatever opinion I like. I thought that is very true, and I like the fire in your belly. So,
embrace that. Absolutely. My middle child turned around to a teacher the other day because they were doing religious. It's not called RE anymore. There's another thing for it. And he just turned around, broad as brass, and said, no, I'm a pagan. And the teacher was like, well, why do you think you're a pagan? And he's like, I don't think I am. I know I am. And that was it. And you do you. Don't be judged by other people. And it's hard. And, particularly as parents, this is the age of social media and judgment and constantly being compared to other people that perhaps, obviously when you and I were that age wasn't so much a thing. Whereas, my 11-year-old is, talking about, he's got a YouTube channel and he's constantly obsessing with who's commenting on it and stuff. And it's like,
yeah.
Just remember, just whatever happens, just dial it back to, it's just you, and you walk your path, and don't worry about other people's judgment, because, I use it as an adult. It's like, even now, this morning on LinkedIn, people sending me comments, disagreeing with things I posted. I'm like, that's cool, and I can have a conversation with you about it, but your opinions don't pay my mortgage, so I don't particularly care.
Like that, your opinions don't, quote unquote. Can I use that on the, you must listen to this podcast?
Did it? Yeah. Mike Dawson talks about why your opinions don't pay his mortgage.
I love that. That is absolutely brilliant. And it's a really good segue in, actually. One, because the you do you bit, I completely subscribe. And that's part of why I do this podcast, that so many people that would be fearful of doing something where you're putting yourself out there, you're talking to people on a really human, honest level, and putting it out there for anybody to listen to. But actually, it's really quite liberating to think, well, you don't have to listen to it. So if you don't like it, don't listen to it. But actually, the amount of comments and feedback that we get from the audience we're aiming to reach to, so it isn't for everybody, it means it's worth it. And I have no doubt that the conversation that we're having today will be useful to many people listening. And I'm certainly loving the conversation. And I really want to move into what you do now. So we've touched on it. We've touched on MDA, and we've touched on your career story to date. But could you just sort of summarize it and maybe share with our listeners sort of what the ethos is of what you're doing now, and how, what it means to you as the founder?
Yeah, so MDA Ltd is essentially, at its core, is a learning and development consultancy. It's a follow-on from what I did as an ETS officer. It makes perfect sense, yada, yada, yada. We have 3 streams. We work in pure L&D, so training analysis, training design, DSAT, as you'll be familiar with, Sam, particularly with defense primes. We have a change management and conflict resolution pillar, and that's everything from exactly what it sounds like: assisting, facilitating change management, running workshops, conflict resolution, which is one of the key contracts I still sit in and physically do. So commercial conflict resolution between partners, ironing out creases, making it more efficient. And then the third stream, which is our not lesser stream, but it takes up a smaller piece of our pie, is the agile stuff. So your scrum masters, your agile coaches, your product owners, and all that sort of stuff. Cool. What's at our core? What's our value? I position MDA Ltd as everything that the current big players in the consultancy net sphere aren't. So the big 4 consultancies, and anyone that follows me on LinkedIn sees that I take pokes at them on a considerable basis. for multiple reasons. From a business perspective, it's because I don't believe they add value. They are adherent to their shareholders, so everything's driven by their profit margin. It's in their interest that a 6-month contract turns into a 12-month contract, turns into a 2-year contract. And that doesn't necessarily correlate with the value that they provide. Now, I will caveat that before someone hunts me down in the street. The people doing the work for those companies are fabulous people. They're fabulous people. And I know lots of them. You know, Chris Shaw, we talk about, you know, his work with Jacobs, you know, fabulous work. But I fundamentally disagree with the model that they use. They're not interested in their clients. You know, we as MDA Limited don't advertise our clients. We don't, oh, we're working with this, we're working with these people. We don't do that. And the reason we don't do that is because we're not pimping out our client list to give us more exposure. So why would you do that? And the only reason you do that is like, look at me, look at who we're working with. Yeah, get over yourself.
Bomb dropped.
Stop pimping out your client list just to get more clients. If your value and your professionalism is good enough, then your clients will speak to their mate clients who will then reach out to you. And that's how
it would be a bit like me saying I'm looking after the finances of XYZ. Yep. You would never say who you're working with because it's confidential. So, you know, yeah, you will get referrals and word of mouth because if you do a good job for them, they'll go and tell the others that, hey, you should go speak to Sam, Mike, whoever. So ultimately, absolutely, you'd almost argue you shouldn't need to do that.
Shouldn't need to do it at all. And again, if companies do that, that's their bag. That's coming back to walk your own path. You do you. If you want to do that, that's cool. But I don't do that, and I will never do that. I could sign a £1 billion contract tomorrow.
You heard it here first. If it comes up online, Mike, we are on you.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like you said 2 years ago,
holding you accountable. Yeah.
You would never do this. Yeah, absolutely. That's the other thing. But it keeps me honest because yeah, I'm so open and transparent on this podcast, with people I talk to, with my clients. It keeps me lean and it keeps me honest and it keeps me true to my values. You know, the values and standards that we were familiar with in the military are still very important to me now, and they're at the core of the business. So I won't involve myself with a client who's got, you know, dodgy ethics or don't align with the morals and standards or the values and standards of my business. I just don't do it. And I've turned down in the last 6 months hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of work because I don't agree with the moral standpoint or the culture of the organization. So I just won't work with them. It's as simple as that.
So you have a strong backbone of values that run through the organisation. But as that grows, and I remember when we last spoke, you were talking about the fact that you've now brought on an assistant, and that's been like revolutionary, and you know, she's done an amazing job. What are some of the biggest challenges that you found and that actually maybe you foresee in terms of building your own business? Because one of the things, and sorry to sort of layer on another question or point, but we talked about the event that we're running with, or Chris Shaw's running as part of the Gender Network, but we're helping to support and plan with. We were talking about actually it shouldn't all be about finding a job and finding a career, but actually we're going to propose that we set up an entrepreneur's corner, that we really focus on having people like yourself there and myself and others, where we can talk about our genuine journey of, you know, the pros and the cons and the good and the bad of sort of setting up your own business and what sort of things to look out for, where to go to get support, you know, all of those sorts of things. So yeah, going back to my sort of earlier point and linking that in, what are the sort of challenges you are facing or have faced, and what's around the corner for those that you can foresee? Obviously you don't have you might have a crystal ball, I don't know.
I wish. It's next to my tarot deck, crystal ball.
Exactly.
So it's not been a problem. The biggest challenges, funnily enough, have been people. And I don't mean that in a horrible way. Because, and I always say to people when I'm talking about change management plans, conflict resolution, agile, whatever it is I'm talking about, I said all the plans are perfect until people touch them. And people confuse everything. And I mean that in a lovely way. I genuinely do. So what I didn't anticipate, because it was never the plan, was managing people from a business perspective. So, you know, people was interested. I need this time off. I need that time off. I need to do this. Yeah, but your contract says you can't do that. You know, I've had I won't name names, but I've had an issue relatively recently where a contract came to an end and the person I put in place, that was fine, all job done. And then 2 days later, said individual approached the client who just worked for and got re-employed by them. And then I found out, because I've got a good relationship with the client, they're like, by the way, this has just happened. So I rang that person up and said, paragraph 6 of your contract, what does it say? And there's a clause in there. And that's not me trapping people, it's protecting my own business. And, the legal ramifications of that. And, coming back even more than that, when the amount, it sounds really strange to say, and it's a bit of a first world problem, but the money the company earns and what thresholds there are, and the moment you cross this threshold from a gross and net profit perspective, that changes your tax brackets, and you now need to pay this. And I went, a while back, I went over the VAT threshold. Awesome, clearly a bit of a milestone for the company. But then in the time it took for me to get from registering to get my VAT registration number, I'd issued invoices in that time, and they were paid, but I then had to go back to those invoices and reissue them with a VAT number
and
on.
Add VAT.
Yeah, and add VAT and credit notes because they've already paid stuff. And I'm like, what is all this stuff? What is going on? But that's how I've decided to run it. And I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago, and they said to me, oh, if you could go back to that day where you set up the business and someone gave you a list of all the things, would it have changed your mind about setting up the business? And the answer for me would probably be yes. Because
I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, I know, I bet. And that person wasn't expecting it either. And the reason I say that is, and it comes back to my mentality, what I love about my journey as an entrepreneur and as a business owner is every single day something else comes up. And some people will really no, I need to know, and they need to plan. But, today, podcast with yourself, and then there's something else going on next week. And then 2 days later, someone says they can't maintain a contract anymore. And, oh, by the way, you can't do this from an accountancy perspective. I enjoy that because I love the idea of having to think on my feet to find a solution to do something. Other people will be like, oh my God, that's the worst thing. But if I'd have known everything from day one, it would have probably been quite overphasing, and to look at it all, but you need to think about this. Because fundamentally, all I wanted to do was set up a limited company so I could put money for it. That's how it started.
Yeah.
That's all it was.
So you were expecting to be that sole trader that runs in that way. Well, not sole trader, obviously, a limited company, but as in an individual.
Yeah.
Working through the.
And you got to that stage where, as we started to tender for significant size contracts, having to change our insurance levels because we didn't have enough indemnity insurance. We only started off at, say, like £1 million, but certain contracts need £10 million. So then going into that and changing it and paying for it. Membership of professional developments, speaking to the military covenant people and the hoops I need to jump through for that in a positive way, meetings with this. And I love that I could come off this podcast now, open my emails, and something's happened. And I absolutely love that, because for me, that's entrepreneurial. It's not
and you're able to deal with it. It's like I had to log on and ask you to hold for a few minutes while I dealt with something that came up with a client that I just needed to crack on with. One, I knew you would understand, but equally it's that thing of, I know I can get this done, and I have this thing of JFDI, just do it. So you'll know, and I just like to get it done, so it's it's in the process. So whilst we're on this call, stuff's happening, and it's that thing of just don't waste a moment.
And I was not too long ago. I was on a trip. I was just with the family, and stuff was going wrong. So my kids were off playing, and I was on the phone. And then my wife turned around to me, and she was like, "Come on!" And I said, "No, because if I don't do it, who's going to do it?" And it needs to be sorted.
Sounds like me. Yeah. My partner's an entrepreneur as well, and he runs his own business. And the amount of grief he gets from me at times, but then he always then reminds me of I'm sat there at stupid o'clock or working at a weekend, and there we go.
Absolutely. And it's shared experiences, isn't it? And it's, as that attitude you have, just get it done. If it's there, get it done. Don't push it right, because it's still going to be you that has to do it. And it's the same with your resettlement. Just do it. Stop, ask loads of questions, go to workshops, go to events, use your payments, get qualifications.
And commit and make it happen. As in, once you commit, and I know a number of people that have struggled with making the decision to leave or not leave. And that, do you know what? There's never a right time. It's a bit like having kids, when people go, there's just in some things in life, you just got to get on and do it, and you make it work, because you can't predict everything.
Sure.
So it is sometimes about just cracking on and working through it, because there will be challenges, and there will be things that you come up against. Equally, there'll be huge highs that come with that.
I say to people all the time that I'm still in love with the army. I left being in love with the army. I wasn't bitter and twisted like you see some people.
I'm with you. Yeah.
I deeply, deeply love the British Army. It gave me everything I've got. But I didn't want to push it so far down the road that I became arsy about it and hated it and then left. That's not who I wanted to be. You know, I've only got positive memories of my service to an extent. There's always negative bits in there, and that's the best way. And because I left on such a positive footing, I wasn't going into the jobs, even I set up a business, but as an example, I wasn't going into the jobs market thinking, I hate the army and I'm going to find something better, because you're setting standards to yourself that aren't necessarily achievable, and you're setting a bar that's too high. Just go out and do. Stop comparing this to that. It's completely different things, and you're never going to find your purpose if all you're doing is comparing what you're trying to do to what you used to do.
I think that is an absolutely brilliant point, and I would, add to that, or sort of, just reaffirm that point, that one of the things that we can really do to actually help ourselves is to just recognize that, so I loved my time in the army. I absolutely love it. A lot of people say to me, do you miss the army, or do you wish you never left? And there is a bit of me that thinks, I'd be retired after 22 years now, by the way, on a full pension, if I had stayed in. But yes, I do miss it, but actually I don't regret leaving when I left. And one of the lessons I had to go through is I have to not compare my professional life now with my life when I was in the military. They're not one and the same. I'm never going to get the same feeling, or the experiences, levels of responsibility, I'm just not, in my mind, but I accept that. And I accept that actually I get my fulfillment in a different way now, and I absolutely love what I do now, but it's just not the same. And I think sometimes if you're continually comparing, to your point, and thinking, because sometimes you can look back rose-tinted spectacles as well, can't you? And think, you'll be whinging down the naffy queue all day long, or whatever. When you leave, everything was amazing.
Yeah.
But just remembering, don't always try and compare, because the military is like no other. But on that note, then, your greatest achievement, what would you say? I mean, it sounds like you've got a lot, but could you bring it into something that summarizes your greatest achievement?
Yeah, my children.
And you're not allowed to say I knew you were going to say it. You've got in before I said you can't say your kids.
My children, 100%. Nothing comes close. Nothing. The business is secondary. My own life is secondary. Everything about my life, come back half step, everything about my life now, from a business perspective, from a personal perspective, is shaping opportunity for my children. That's it. And ensuring that they have the tools that they require to become good human beings and make good choices, informed decisions, have the ability to walk a path they choose and not have doors shut to them. So, I say to people all the time, and it's not an exaggeration, if somebody turned around to me this afternoon and said, you, meaning me physically, would lose everything you've got, all your money, everything, your house, you'd go back to what it was when you were 14, but your children would have every opportunity available to them, I'd do it in a heartbeat. Done. They wouldn't even finish the sentence. Everything about my life is geared towards my children, everything. And comes back to the point, we were talking about previously, when I said about the positive connotations of my experience is as a child or as a teenager. Everything about my life is to make sure that my children don't have to experience what I had to experience. And that there'll be people listening to this with similar stories, perhaps in different contexts, but it's a similar thing. So, my wife and I argue like most married couples do.
Every couple does, yeah.
100%. But I always have that. I don't want the children to hear this. I don't want them to hear that, because I remember hearing it as a child and how that shaped me and all that sort of stuff. So not that we argue like that, just to clarify, but that's it. It's nothing comes close. Nothing. I could have £100 billion business next year, and it still wouldn't compare to the fact that I've got 3 kids, well, nearly 4.
Yeah, that is amazing. And I think really relatable. And I always use an analogy about the glass ball and the rubber ball. Your family is your glass ball, and your career is your rubber ball. If you drop the rubber ball, it will bounce back. You can make it bounce back. There might be but you might drop the ball. If you drop your family, you drop your glass ball, even if you manage to piece it back together, it will never be the same. It will always be fragile. It will always have cracks. It might even have missing pieces. And I always, you know, if I have to test myself or my partner, you know, we've got 4 children between us and we're going, oh, just remember the glass ball, rubber ball, and it just brings it all back into perspective. So yeah.
So I use small circle, big circle. Everything in the small circles is stuff that matters and stuff you can change and stuff you can influence, and all that's in there is business and family. Everything else is big circle stuff, and I don't care.
Yeah, love it. Mike, if you could share, what doesn't have to be one, but maybe 1 or 2 golden nuggets with people listening today in terms of whether it's lessons you've learned or sort of takeaway points, what would you share with us?
I think we've touched on a few already, but if I was to pick a couple more, and I'm thinking more from a business and perspective now, is you can't overestimate the importance of LinkedIn. And that's regardless of whether you're looking for a job, setting up a company, just building a network or a brand or whatever it is you're doing. You know, for me personally, and I think I mentioned this to you when we spoke last, over 75% of the income generated by my company in the first 12 months came from LinkedIn. Fact. My very first contract, when it was just about me, came from LinkedIn. The next one came from LinkedIn. The massive one that we got not too long ago came from LinkedIn. And it's massively important. And, you know, I put a post up a couple of days ago similar to this, and it was like, there's a lot of people on LinkedIn that were going to sell you their knowledge, and I can help you do this and I can help you do that, and blah 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 blah. Ignore all of it. Listen to it, listen to it, and, you know, just see what's in there. But use some of it, don't use any of it, ignore all of it, do what you want. But the biggest piece of advice from a business perspective, actually, let me come back to the actual question, is don't fall into the trap with these people saying, oh, if you pay me £3,000 a month, I'll be able to do this for you and grow your business exponentially. They're all talking rubbish. They're all liars. They can't. And you only have to look at their business history to realize they don't have a clue about business. So trust yourself. Don't get in. If you're setting up a business, don't put yourself in somebody else's pocket straight away, because you'll never get out of it.
Yeah.
Own your own journey. You know, I will never have shareholders, ever. I don't care. The business could be financially falling on its ass. I will never have shareholders, because it's my path. And as I mentioned before, it either succeeds because of me or it fails because of me. And that's the crux of it. So yeah, so LinkedIn, get in and around the networks, get stuck in, get on the Gendit network, ask questions, and don't be afraid to ask questions either. You know, organize calls, you know, send a message, stop sending blank connection requests. That's another advice I'd give for LinkedIn. It breaks me. But yeah, tell me who you are and what you're looking for.
Or stop sending me a connection request with it and then detailing something you've got to either try to sell me, or because I just delete those straight away. If somebody connects with you and they're going, by the way, this, and this, no.
So I fall in that trap, and I do the same with people when they cold call me on the phone. Is I answer those things, and I'm like, oh, tell me more. I'm not interested. It's like you've wasted my time, so I'm going to waste yours. Don't, because I'm just that way inclined. I'm a nuisance. But yeah, just don't do that. And the crux, the core of that answer, Sam, is LinkedIn. You know, it's going to find it will find you work. And if I use something I found, and I've not said this that often actually, when it was just about me and I was just using a limited company to find a contract, I have a spreadsheet on this laptop of all the jobs posts I replied to before I got a positive answer. And it's over 200. So these people going on, I've sent my CV out to this number of, yeah, okay, awesome, keep going. Oh, but I'm not getting any answers. My spreadsheet's color coded. Yeah. Amber is I've sent my CV. I don't do it anymore because I don't need to. Amber's I've sent my CV. Green is I've got a response. No, sorry, blue's I've got a response. Green is I've got a positive response and it's resulted in something. And that first 3 months, over 200 things in there, there's 3 greens.
Wow.
Just keep going. Just keep doing. Just keep sending. Keep asking. If you're lucky enough
curious.
if you're lucky enough to get the first thing you apply for, the gleaming, That's so good. Amazing. Ride that wave. But you know what? If it's the 500th thing, it's the 500th thing. Just keep going. It's a bit demoralizing at times, but what's the alternative? Just
Yeah,
stop.
love that. Yeah. Be persistent, be consistent. And you know what? And things do just happen. We were talking about earlier, back when I was on the call to a client, and one of the first things I said was, "Oh, congrats on your LinkedIn post." And I was like, "What?" They're like, I saw your LinkedIn post, which, if you listen, you might have heard it was about a rail card, and I've got about 1 million views on it. And I was like, okay, that's great, but it wasn't purposeful to get that. But the conversations that have come from that, in terms of the reach that it's got, it's been incredible. And the sort of people that I'm now connected with and having conversations with and taking them forward. And so the point being, if you go back at my other posts, there are some on there that have had barely any engagement. There's some in there that have mediocre, but you don't know when something is going to hook, and then it creates a ripple effect. And that's the point. You just got to keep going, be yourself. And if you're being really authentic, then good things will happen. If you're trying to be something you're not, or someone you're not, then actually it's never going to take off.
And it's a double-edged sword. And it's interesting you mentioned your post about the Veterans Rail Card, because the same day, and the point, so the same day you posted that, somebody else posted, a veteran posted about the Veterans Rail Card, complaining about it, saying how they got on the train and they weren't able to use it. And actually the crux of it was that if you get on a peak time train, say before 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, there's like a minimum order value you have to have before they take the 30% or whatever off, and it's 12 quid. And this person was complaining about it, and I reached out to them and I was like, you do realize how that looks? You're actively using this platform to find a job, and you're putting a post out complaining about having to spend £12. Just stop and take a breath and think about how you're portraying yourself. Because fundamentally, for many people, their LinkedIn profile is their CV. And and you'll know this, Sam, how many conversations have you initiated or been initiated by someone to you, and you've jumped on their LinkedIn profile to find out about them before you speak to them?
Yeah, most.
You get a feel for who that type of person is, their history, their employment history, all that sort of stuff. So if you've got posts on there complaining about having to spend a couple of quid, it probably doesn't start you off on the right foot when you're opening a conversation with somebody about a prospective job. So just, and this sounds a little bit, hypocritical of me, because a lot of the stuff I post about is a bit tongue in cheek. It's taking stabs at people. So people say, yeah, but you post mental stuff. And I do, you're right. But what I do is, luckily, is I've built a platform and a niche for myself and the company in the market that enables me to make content
like that. Yeah. And that is your brand, and I mean, your personal brand and your sort of persona and your thoughts. So you just bring that to life.
Yeah. Whereas if you haven't established that and you're just going in negativity, it's going to portray you in a very, very bad way. So just take a breath before you post. And if it's not important, then just don't worry about it. It's 12 quid.
And I think that's a really good point to end on, in terms of not just with LinkedIn, but with most things, in terms of take a breath, as you often do, and take yourself back to that, whatever challenge you might face in life. I rarely meet somebody in life that hasn't faced some form of really difficult time. Take yourself back to that, and how actually bringing life back into perspective. After a deep breath, you realise that it's an inconvenience, and it might be very stressful and difficult, whatever it might be. But equally, what's the alternative of not getting old? Wow. And not having stress. It's not being here. So I'll take the stress and getting old.
Yeah, absolutely. Just crack on. Don't worry about it. There are more important things going on in the world than that 60 seconds where something negative happened to you. And obviously there are exceptions to that. Clearly there are extreme exceptions to that, but don't worry about 100%. It. Just crack on.
Thanks, Mike. I have really loved this conversation, and I know that we've gone over our normal sort of time period. So if you've carried on listening to us, I'm so pleased you've stuck with that. I have no doubt that you have, and I feel like I could carry on talking to you for a lot longer. So I will bend your ear when I next see you at the Bristol event. Looking forward to doing more work with you. Best of luck with what you're doing with the business. And it sounds as though you've got just the amazing family. So, much love to you all, and hope to speak to you again soon. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you so much, Sam. Like I said, it was a real privilege to be on your podcast, and I really, really appreciate your time. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Sam.